The blast door blew inward before Mara Voss got her hands off the bars, and the corridor beyond her cell turned to fire and screaming in the same half-second. Alarms she didn't recognize climbed through 3 registers she felt more than heard, a bone-deep throb under the sirens, and the guard who had been posted outside her cage for 6 days without once meeting her eyes was suddenly gone, his post empty, his rifle rack rattling on its mount from a concussion 2 decks up. She didn't move at first. 6 days chained to Corvith time had taught her that much. You waited, you watched, you learned which noises meant a door was about to open on you and which meant it wasn't. This noise meant something else. This meant the ship itself was coming apart at a seam nobody had shown her on the manifest. Smoke rolled down the corridor in a flat gray sheet, hugging the deck the way smoke did in atmosphere that was still being scrubbed, still breathable, which told her the hull hadn't been breached, not yet. Small mercy. She pressed her face to the bars and saw a shape stagger past her cell door, 7 feet of dark chitin plate and quill-fringed shoulders, one arm hanging wrong, leaving a trail of something black and glistening across the deck plates. Corvith blood oxidized the color of tar. She'd learned that on day 2, when they'd dragged her past the infirmary. The shape didn't look at her. It was running from something, not toward her, and that told her more than the alarms did. Mara had grown up reading machines the way other people read faces, the particular whine of a bearing about to seize, the stutter in a pressure gauge that meant a seal was failing before the gauge itself knew it. 10 years hauling ice and ore out of the belt around Aldergate Station in her mother's tug had taught her that everything mechanical told you the truth eventually, whether or not you wanted to hear it. This ship was screaming the truth right now. Something had gone catastrophically, violently wrong aboard the most powerful warship in the Corvith Ascendancy's fleet, and whatever it wasn't her. Yet, she heard boots. Corvith didn't wear boots. Exactly. Their digitigrade feet were sheathed in articulated plating that struck the deck in a rhythm no human foot ever made, coming fast from the direction the wounded one had fled. 3 sets, maybe 4. She backed from the bars into the corner of her cell out of animal instinct, and then made herself stop, made herself look instead of hide, because hiding hadn't done her any good in 22 years and it wasn't going to start now. The 3 Corvith who came around the bend wore black plate scored with a sigil she hadn't seen on any of the crew who'd processed her. A coiled double helix over crossed blades, painted crude and fast, like it had been stenciled onto their shoulder guards in the last hour instead of issued from stores. Boarders, not her ship's own security, answering an alarm. These 3 were hunting, weapons up, moving with the loose, economical violence of soldiers who expected resistance and were disappointed not to find it yet. One of them slowed at her cell. Its neck frill, collapsed flat and pale with adrenaline, flushed a sudden hot amber as it looked at her through the bars. Corvith couldn't lie with their frills, not even if they wanted to, every flare and fade a broadcast of whatever moved under the plate. Amber meant contempt. It meant not a threat, not worth the round asterisk. The soldier said something to its companions in the subsonic register that made Mara's molars ache, and the 3 of them moved on without breaking stride, leaving her locked in a cage in the middle of a war she didn't understand yet. She let out the breath she'd been holding and found her hands were steady. That surprised her a little. It shouldn't have. Her hands had been steady over worse than this, steady over a ruptured coolant line with her mother bleeding out from a wrench that had slipped on a 60-year-old fitting, steady threading a fuel line disconnect 2 centimeters from a Corvith tithe cutter's ignition coil with an armed constable 40 meters away. Steady was the only thing she had that nobody had been able to take when they cuffed her and put her on this ship 8 days ago. 8 days ago she had been standing in the gutted engine well of her mother's tug, up to her elbows in a coolant manifold that 3 different Ascendancy inspectors had already condemned as unsalvageable, when the tithe cutter came down on Aldergate's docking ring with its running lights dark and its manifest sealed. The Corvith called it an audit. Everyone on the ring called it what it was, a shakedown, the same one that came every quarter, skimming a percentage of whatever a human colony had scraped out of the belt that season and calling the skimming a debt owed for the privilege of breathing Ascendancy air. Mara had not set out to sabotage anything. She had set out to keep 4 families' worth of ice hauls from being seized on a technicality invented 40 minutes before the inspector's shuttle touched down, and the only tool she'd had to do it with was the same tool she had for everything. She understood the manifest lock better than the man who'd installed it, and she had rerouted its verification chain in under 6 minutes, while an armed constable stood 40 meters off believing he was watching a routine inspection, instead of watching a woman quietly rewrite the rules of who owed what to whom. They had caught her 3 weeks later, not because she'd made a mistake, but because someone on the ring had needed a name to give the inspectors, and hers was cheaper to give up than anyone else's. 8 days in a cell, 6 of them aboard a warship whose name she hadn't even known until a guard sneered it at her. The Hollow Crown, flagship of a fleet that had never lost a system it wanted to keep, waiting to be shipped somewhere the Ascendancy process tithe crimes, it considered too large for a colony magistrate to handle alone. She had told herself, every one of those 6 days, that whatever came next would be some new flavor of the same old math, somebody with more power than her deciding what her hands were worth and to whom. It had not once occurred to her that the ship itself might come apart in her favor before anyone got around to deciding. The 6 days after her transfer to the Hollow Crown had taught her things about herself she hadn't known she needed to learn. She had catalogued, without meaning to, the exact rhythm of the guard rotations, the 3 words of the guard's idle chatter that repeated often enough to guess at meaning before she'd ever heard a translator render them, the particular quality of silence that fell over the detention block whenever a superior officer walked the corridor above. She had done it the same way she'd once catalogued the failure sounds of every engine on Aldergate's docking ring, not because anyone asked her to, but because a mind built for reading machines did not know how to stop reading, and a cage, it turned out, was just another system with rules underneath it waiting to be understood. She had told herself it was pointless. Understanding a cage did not open it. She had kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was 6 days of simply waiting to be told what happened to her next, and waiting was the one thing her whole life had taught her never to do quietly. The alarms cut out. In the ringing silence that followed, a new voice came over what she now understood was the ship's general address, not Corvith this time, but a translation matrix, flat and only slightly wrong in its cadence, relaying words that had been spoken somewhere else in the burning ship. All decks, all decks. Flagship Hollow Crown is under seizure by forces loyal to Fleet-Marshal V. Horace Kelra. Surrender your stations. Resistance is being logged individually. Mara sat back on her heels in the corner of her cell and understood, with the particular clarity that came to her only in the worst moments, that she was locked inside a war for the ownership of the single most dangerous machine she had ever been aboard, and that not one soul currently fighting over it had the faintest idea she was here or cared. That was, she thought, probably going to be a mistake on somebody's part. She didn't wait long to test it. 10 minutes into the ship's convulsions, with the general address cycling its surrender demand for the 4th time, footsteps came again, different this time, unhurried, deliberate, a single set. Mara flattened against the bars and watched a Corvith woman in command crimson lacquer walk into view, one hand pressed to a wound at her side that had already soaked black through 2 layers of plate, the other hand dragging a data slate she was keying with quick, precise jabs, despite the tremor running visibly through her frill. The woman's eyes, pale gold, slitted, older than any Corvith Mara had seen aboard, found her through the bars, and for the first time in 8 days, something looked back at Mara that wasn't contempt or indifference. "You are the human," the woman said. Ship's translator caught the words with a half-second lag, flattening the subsonic undertone into something almost gentle. "The tithe saboteur, Aldergate." Mara Voss, She didn't see the use in denying it. Captain Wren shot Oral. The woman's knees buckled, and she caught herself against the corridor wall, leaving a black handprint on the bulkhead. My ship is being taken from me, human. In perhaps 10 minutes it will not matter to anyone which faction holds it. Mara's stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's failing environmental controls. What does that mean? The captain didn't answer directly. She turned the data slate toward the cell door's lock plate instead, keyed something with the last steady motion of her ruined arm, and the bars hummed and dropped half a centimeter out of true, unlatched, not opened, a distinction Mara filed away and would need in about 4 seconds. It means, Shot Oral said, that I have just armed the Hollow Crown's purge directive. Reactor scuttle. If Voss takes my ship, he takes nothing but slag and a debt he cannot pay the Ascendancy. 58 minutes, human. Then this vessel and everyone still aboard it stop being a problem for anyone. You're going to kill your own crew. I am going to kill a mutiny. The captain's frill had gone the deep, steady blue Mara had learned, in 8 days of careful watching, meant something close to grief. 58 minutes is enough for the loyal to reach the launch bays. It is not my fault if traders do not run fast enough. And me. Something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile moved through the captain's mandibles. You are cargo I forgot to release. That is what my report would have said, had I lived to write one. She pressed the slate into the gap of the door, into Mara's hand, through the unlatched bars. This carries diagnostic authority, not command authority. I could not give you that if I wished to. The throne would not accept a stranger's grip regardless of what codes you carry. But it will open doors that would otherwise kill you for trying, and it will show you which corridors are still atmosphere and which are already vacuum. Whatever you do with the time you have, human, do not do it slowly. She turned to go, favoring the ruined side of her body, and made it 4 steps before her legs simply stopped working, and she went down against the bulkhead in a controlled, silent collapse that told Mara everything about how much pain the captain had been hiding for the length of that conversation. Mara was out of the cell, and at her side before she decided to move. Don't, Shot Oral said, when Mara's hands found the wound and the amount of blood registered on her face. There is no fixing this. There is only the 58 minutes and what you choose to spend them on. Her gold eyes fixed on Mara's with an intensity that cut through the translator's flatness. You could reach a launch pod from here in 6 minutes. I would not blame you. Mara thought about it. She thought about it honestly, for the length of one full breath, because she had never in her life pretended bravery. She didn't feel bravery you pretended got people killed, on ice halls and everywhere else. 6 minutes to a pod. A clean run if the corridors held. Nobody aboard this ship, loyalist or mutineer, thought about her as anything but cargo, and cargo that vanished into an escape pod during a mutiny was cargo nobody would waste a second chasing. Then she thought about 58 minutes and a reactor core, and about however many hundred crew, Corvith, sure, but crew, people who bled and feared exactly the way the woman dying in front of her was bleeding and had, until 30 seconds ago, been afraid, who had no idea a clock had started on their lives. Where's the throne? Mara said. The one the ship actually listens to. The captain's frill flared, gold-white, an expression Mara didn't have a translation for yet and wouldn't get one for another 40 minutes. The bridge is 11 decks up and on the other end of the ship from a war. You would not reach it walking. Why me? Mara asked, before she could stop herself. You could have opened this cell for any of the crew loyal enough to still be standing. Why hand a stranger your ship's last chance? Shot Oral's frill flickered through something Mara would only later learn to call rueful. Because every officer loyal enough to still be standing believes, to their marrow, that this ship answers to rank, to blood, to the correct ceremony performed in the correct order. They would spend minutes I do not have arguing about protocol before they ever touched a lock that wasn't built to open for them. You do not know enough about my empire to know you are not supposed to try. That ignorance, human, is the only qualification that matters in the next 56 minutes. I've never once in my life reached anywhere by walking when there was a faster way and nobody watching the faster way. Mara took the slate, closed the captain's hand around the wound to buy her another few minutes of blood, and did not let herself think too hard about the fact that she was choosing, with her whole clear mind, to run toward the fire instead of away from it. Which way's the maintenance side? Shadorl told her. It was the last full sentence she had breath for, and by the time Mara reached the end of the corridor and looked back, the captain of the Hollow Crown was gone, not dead yet by the look of the slate's biometric feed still bound to her name, but gone from where Mara had left her, dragged or crawled somewhere out of sight to do whatever a dying Corvette captain did with her last minutes aboard a ship no longer hers to command. 56 minutes left on the counter stamped into the corner of the slate's display. Mara Voss put her back against a bulkhead that was still warm from a nearby fire suppression discharge, made herself breathe once slow, and went looking for a way up. The maintenance side of a Corvette dreadnought, it turned out, was not so different from the maintenance side of anything else Mara had ever crawled through, narrower, colder, built for four-jointed limbs instead of two, but the logic underneath was the same logic that ran every machine she'd ever kept alive. Pressure went where pressure was allowed to go. Power followed the path an engineer had decided, decades ago, to make cheapest. Somebody, somewhere, always cut a corner, and the corner they cut was always the one a person in trouble could use. She found the corner 4 minutes later, a service shaft meant for drone repair crawlers, barely wide enough for her shoulders, running vertical through 6 decks with a maintenance ladder bolted along one wall for the rare occasions a technician had to go in by hand. The lock on the shaft's lower hatch was keyed to a Corvette palm print sensor she had no way of fooling, until she remembered the slate in her jacket, keyed with diagnostic authority, and pressed it flat against the sensor's housing instead of the reader itself. The old trick. Aldergate's tugs had run security systems from 3 different manufacturers, none of which had ever quite trusted each other, and a diagnostic override screaming * emergency access. Hull integrity check into a lock's maintenance port worked the same whether the lock was built by a corporation on a rock in the belt or a shipyard orbiting a Corvette throne world. The hatch groaned and slid open on a shaft that smelled like ozone and hot metal. 51 minutes, she started climbing. She was 3 decks up when the shaft told her, in the language she trusted more than any voice on this ship, that something ahead had gone badly wrong. The rhythm changed first, a shift in the pressure against her ears that had nothing to do with altitude, the specific deep throb of air being pulled somewhere it shouldn't be pulled that fast. Then the ladder itself, steady metal under her palms for 2 decks, began to hum with a vibration that climbed in pitch the higher she went, and at the next maintenance junction she found why. A bulkhead seal 3 meters ahead had buckled under the same battle damage that had rocked the ladder earlier, and behind it, hissing louder with every second, a hull-side conduit had ruptured into a slow bleed of atmosphere that the ship's automated systems hadn't yet flagged, too busy fighting 100 other fires to notice one quiet leak in a shaft nobody official was supposed to be climbing. 50 minutes. She could go around, she was almost certain from the schematic glowing faint on Shadorl's slate, an alternate junction 2 decks further that would add 6 minutes she didn't have to spare. Or she could fix it, the way she'd fixed 100 small ruptures on Aldergate's tugs with nothing but a multi-tool and the specific, patient stubbornness that had never once in her whole life accepted that a leak was somebody else's problem to solve later. She fixed it. It took 90 seconds of work with tools that weren't built for her hands, on a valve housing designed by an empire that had never once imagined a human wrist finding the leverage point. A 4-jointed limb would have reached without thinking. 90 seconds she spent with her ears popping and her eyes watering in thinning air, seating a patch clamp she'd improvised from a length of conduit strap and sheer refusal to fail, until the hiss cut out and the pressure in her ears settled back to something breathable. She sat back against the ladder afterward, breathing hard, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel how close that had been before she kept climbing, because 48 minutes did not forgive 3 seconds becoming 4. She heard the fighting before she reached the third deck, a percussive stutter of energy weapons discharging somewhere close on the other side of half a meter of hull plating, and felt the ladder shudder twice under an impact she chose not to think too hard about. At the third deck maintenance hatch she stopped, cracked it 2 centimeters, and looked out onto a scene that told her more about the war for the Hollow Crown than the captain's 10 sentences had. A knot of Corvith and Ascendancy gray loyalists, she guessed, matching what little of the ship's own crew colors she'd seen, were falling back down a corridor strung with smoke and sparking conduit, firing behind them at pursuers in the black and crimson plate she now recognized from the 3 who'd passed her cell. It wasn't an even fight. The Loyalists were maybe 6, the boarders at least twice that, and even to Mara's untrained eye, the boarders moved like soldiers who trained for this specifically, breaching corridors in practiced pairs, while the ship's own crew fought like people who'd been doing supply runs and diplomatic escort until an hour ago and were dying to learn otherwise. Mara watched one of the Loyalist crew, young, frills still flashing the ragged, uneven flicker she was starting to recognize as raw fear, rather than any of the colors that had names yet, drop to one knee behind a coolant strut to drag a fallen crewmate by the harness, one-handed, weapon still trained back down the corridor with the other. It was not soldiers' economy. It was the same desperate, inefficient effort she'd have made for anyone she couldn't stand to leave behind, the kind of effort that cost you seconds you didn't have, and you spent anyway, because the alternative was a kind of math you couldn't live with afterward. The strut took 2 hits meant for both of them before the pair made it around the bend and out of Mara's narrow field of view, and she found she was gripping the hatch's edge hard enough to hurt. One of the Loyalists went down hard, plate cratered by a shot that punched clean through, and didn't get up. Mara made herself watch it, made herself not look away, because looking away from what a fight actually cost was how people ended up believing fights were easy. She let the hatch swing shut before anyone thought to check it and kept climbing. The 5th deck junction was quieter, and that quiet turned out to be worse. She came up through the hatch into a control alcove that had clearly been fought over already and lost 3 Corvith bodies, border colors, sprawled across a bank of consoles that were still sparking intermittently, and a 4th figure crouched behind an overturned equipment rack, alive, tending a wound in its own shoulder with quick, competent motions that had nothing panicked in them. It saw her the instant she cleared the hatch. She saw it see her. For 1 full second neither of them moved, 2 very different kinds of trapped animal working out whether the other was a threat, and Mara noted, filed it away automatically, the way she filed away every reading on every gauge she'd ever watched, that this one's frill wasn't flushing amber contempt the way the corridor patrols had. It was flushing a fast, uneven flicker of color she didn't have a name for. Confusion, maybe, or the frill equivalent of a held breath. "You are not crew," it said, in a voice the translator rendered thin and strained. Not a warrior's build, she registered leaner through the shoulders than the boarders had been. No combat plate, just a maintenance harness scorched down one side, tools clipped where a soldier would have carried spare charge packs. "You are the prisoner, the human." "I was." Mara kept both hands visible empty and didn't come further into the alcove than the hatch's threshold. "Captain Shador'll let me out. She's dying somewhere on deck 2 and she armed the purge directive on her way down. 50 minutes, maybe less now." The Corvith's frill went rigid, every color draining out of it at once, which Mara understood without needing a translator, without needing 8 days of careful watching, was very close to the universal expression for asterisk, oh no asterisk. "You are certain," it said. "I watched her key it. She had a data slate, this one." Mara held it up. "Diagnostic authority," she said. "Not command." The Corvith stared at the slate, then at her, and made a decision Mara watched happen across its whole body, the wariness folding down into something more like calculation. "I'm Isk Vantor, Wright cast, reactor systems, third shift." It rose from behind the rack, favoring the wounded shoulder, and did not raise the tool it held like a weapon, which in the last 5 minutes Mara had learned to read as a significant piece of information about a Corvith's intentions. Wrights do not carry combat plate. Wrights are not expected to matter in a mutiny, which is a courtesy that has apparently gotten most of my shift killed for standing where the boarders wanted to stand. If the purge is armed human, in 50 minutes it will not matter who wins this ship. There will be no ship. So we stop it. Asterisk, you cannot stop it. The directive answers only to command authority at the throne itself, and the throne recognizes command lineage through the grip manifold, a haptic sequence bonded to the captain's own hand geometry and pressure signature, recalibrated at every change of command in a formal ascension ceremony that takes days, not minutes. Shah-Doral is presumably not walking to the bridge to unwind her own directive. And even if she were, V. Horace's people currently hold the approach to the bridge deck with a strength I would not commit 6 armed loyalists against, let alone a Wright and an unarmed human. Mara looked at the ruined consoles, at the 3 bodies, at the tools still loose in Isk's uninjured hand, and did the kind of arithmetic she'd been doing her whole life over engines other people had already written off as dead. "You said the throne reads pressure signature, not identity. Not blood, not rank pressure." "That is a simplification, but broadly, yes." "Then it's a lock." Something in Mara's chest, some old cold competence that had gotten her through worse odds than this, with a wrench and a stubborn refusal to accept that a machine could beat her, settled into place. Every lock that reads pressure instead of a key can be taught a new pressure, or fooled into thinking it's already reading the right one. I've broken into my own family's tug 3 times because my mother lost the manual override chip, and the palm lock didn't care whose hand it was. It cared whether the hand pressed the right sequence in the right order. That's not command authority. That's a haptic combination lock wearing a fancier name. Isk's frill did something complicated. The color equivalent, Mara would decide later, of a person narrowing their eyes. "You intend to walk onto the bridge of the most heavily defended deck on this ship, past however many of V. Horace's people currently hold it, and pick the lock on a command throne built by an empire that has never once imagined a human hand touching it." "I intend to try, because the other plan is dying in an escape pod I didn't quite reach in time, and I've never liked that plan for anything." Mara looked at the counter on the slate. 47 minutes. "You know this ship's guts better than I do. I know how to make a machine believe something it shouldn't. If we're doing this, we do it together, because I am not getting through a hostile-held bridge deck on my own, and you are not stopping a reactor purge without whatever's on that throne." For a long moment Isk didn't answer, just looked at her with those slitted gold eyes, frill working through colors that had no clean human translation, weighing. She understood this later, once she'd learned enough of the species to be sure, not just the plan but the strangeness of it. The fact that a Wright who had spent a career being told he did not matter in a war was being asked to bet the last 47 minutes of his life on the competence of a species his empire taxed and jailed, and had never once, in his memory, treated as capable of holding a weapon that mattered. "My caste has a saying," Isk said finally. "The machine does not care who built it, it cares who understands it." He clipped the tool back to his harness and drew, from a panel in the ruined console bank, a slim rectangular device that hummed faintly when he thumbed it active. "Reactor interlock key. It will not stop the directive by itself, but it will buy us a floor to stand on when we try. Come. The service crawlways run under the boarder's line of advance. I know where they thin out." 46 minutes, and for the first time since the blast door had blown, Mara Voss had something that felt less like survival and more like a plan. The crawlway Isk led her into ran narrower than the drone shaft, barely a meter across, ribbed with conduit that pulsed warm under her palms as she moved. He went first on all fours with an ease 4 extra joints made look obscene. She went after him hunched double, elbows and knees finding a rhythm that reminded her, absurdly, of squeezing through Aldergate's cargo tug when a coolant seal blew mid-haul, and there was no one else small enough or foolish enough to go in after it. Something about the memory steadied her more than it should have. They passed under a sealed hatch 2 decks up from which she could hear boots, Corveth boots, the boarder's particular staggered 4-beat gait, moving directly overhead, close enough that dust sifted down between the deck plates onto her upturned face. She froze. Isk didn't. "They will not scan for us here," he murmured, barely audible even in the crawlway's dead air. "Threat sensors on combat plate are tuned to our own biology, adrenal bloom, frill flush heat signature, the vocal subsonic a Corveth throws off under stress. You throw none of it. To their armor you read as background, ambient, cargo. So I'm invisible. You are asterisk uninteresting asterisk, which on this ship tonight is better." He kept moving. "It will not last. Someone will eventually think to hunt with their eyes instead of their plate." "Why does a Wright know how border threat sensors are tuned?" Mara asked, mostly to keep her mind off the 4-jointed silhouette moving through the dark ahead of her, mostly because she wanted, in the middle of all of this, to know one more true thing about the person she was trusting with the next half hour of her life. Because Wrights are the ones who calibrate them. Isk didn't slow. "We build the plate, we tune the sensors, we wire the interlocks that let a combat unit walk past a live reactor conduit without cooking itself. And then the cast that wears what we build looks through us in the mess hall as though the hands that kept them alive that morning were beneath acknowledging. It is not cruelty, exactly. It is simply that my caste has never, in the history of the Ascendancy, been permitted to hold a claim right, and a species builds its manners around what it is willing to see." A pause, filled by the scrape of his plating against conduit. "I do not say this so that you will pity Wrights, human. I say it because you asked me, in a cargo junction with 41 minutes on a dying woman's clock, to trust that your competence was worth betting my life on. And I would like you to understand that I know exactly what that bet costs, because I have spent every day of my service paying a version of it to people who never once thanked me for it." Mara thought about Aldergate, about ice halls and tithe cutters, and a decade of watching men with more rank than sense assume that a woman covered in coolant grease couldn't possibly be the reason their engines still ran. "Where I'm from," she said, "we've got a word for people who build the thing and never get the credit for keeping it alive. We call them the ones who actually matter, and we don't say it where the inspectors can hear." Something in Isk's frill flickered gold-white again, quick, there and gone before she could be sure she'd seen it right. "Then perhaps," he said, "your species and my caste have more in common than either of our empires have ever bothered to notice." She filed that away too, a blind spot, not a cloak, temporary and dependent on nobody looking directly at her, and kept crawling. The crawlway dumped them into a cargo transfer junction 2 decks below the fighting, a wide vaulted space stacked with sealed containers and lit by amber emergency strips instead of the ship's usual cold white. Isk went still at the hatch, listening, and Mara used the pause to read the room the way she'd read every unfamiliar space in her life. Exits first, then hazards, then opportunity. She found the opportunity fast. A bank of container lock controls on the near wall, magnetic clamps and pressure seals, the kind of industrial hardware that looked different on every world she'd ever worked but always, underneath the housing, did the same handful of things. 41 minutes, Isk said, checking the slate. "The bridge approach is 2 decks up and the whole width of the ship away. V. Horace will have it sealed behind at minimum a full combat section. Then we don't walk up to it. We make it come to us, or we go around it entirely." Mara was already moving to the container controls, running her fingers along the housing until she found the diagnostic port. Every industrial system had one, tucked somewhere a designer thought only a technician would look, and every diagnostic port on every system she'd ever met spoke some dialect of the same handful of languages. She pressed the captain's slate against it. The housing lit, cycled, and displayed a schematic neither of them could fully read, half Corvith glyphs and half raw system architecture, that needed no translation at all to anyone who'd spent a decade reading pressure curves. This whole junction's on an independent gravlock circuit. If I can find where it ties into main structural power, you would collapse containment on 40 tons of cargo. I would collapse containment on 40 tons of cargo at a moment I choose, onto a corridor full of people who are not currently expecting the deck under them to become a weapon. She looked up at him. Your people fight with claim right and challenge and rank. Mine fight with whatever's bolted to the wall. It's not a fair fight if I make it one. Something in Isk's frill flickered gold-white again. That expression she still had no clean word for, though she was starting to suspect it, meant something close to "I did not expect this from you, and I am recalculating. Show me the schematic." They worked it out together in 6 minutes that felt like 60. Mara reading load paths and Isk reading the Corvith glyphs labeling which conduits fed which decks. And between the two of them, they found what she'd been looking for, a service junction, 3 corridors over where the border's most direct route to the bridge crossed directly beneath the cargo bay's gravlock circuit. Isk keyed the reactor interlock device to bridge a false authorization into the container system, buying them 30 seconds of unsupervised access before ship security. Whichever faction currently held it noticed the anomaly. Mara used 28 of them. They lost 2 of those 28 seconds to a heartbeat of pure animal stillness when boots sounded on the deck directly above the junction box. Border boots, unhurried, the particular staggered 4-beat gait she'd learned to dread, pausing for one endless second almost exactly overhead before continuing on toward wherever their patrol route actually led. Isk didn't breathe. Mara didn't either. When the sound finally faded, her hands were shaking for the first time all night. A fine, useless tremor she made herself stare down until it stopped, because a schematic didn't care how frightened the hands reading it were, and neither did a clock. The detonation, when it came 4 minutes later as the border's second wave moved through the corridor below, wasn't fire. It was worse, in the specific way Mara had built it to be worse. 11 containers of raw ore concentrate, mass she'd calculated off the housing's own manifest data, dropping 2 meters through a deck that had never been rated to hold them, driven by gravlock coils she'd inverted instead of disengaged. The boarders didn't die, not most of them. She'd aimed for the deck plating, not the bodies, because there was a difference between a weapon and a massacre, and she intended to stay on the correct side of it even now. But the corridor buckled, sealed itself on emergency bulkheads, and swallowed an entire advancing section behind a wall of jammed cargo and screaming alarms that would take V. Horace's forces the better part of an hour to clear by hand. 36 minutes. Somewhere on the other side of that wall of ore concentrate, a voice was shouting orders in the deep subsonic register Mara's chest recognized now even without the translator's help. And underneath the fury in it, she thought, she let herself hope, she heard something that sounded almost like uncertainty. They didn't get long to feel it. The junction's alarm had barely finished cycling when 6 figures broke from a side corridor at a dead run, Ascendancy gray, not border black, loyalist crew fleeing in the opposite direction from the collapse, weapons half raised at the 2 shapes standing over the wreckage until one of them, a broad-shouldered Corvith with a command stripe scorched down one shoulder plate, recognized Isk and barked something that made the others lower their aim. Behind him, Mara would learn the names over the next 20 minutes in the clipped shorthand of people who might not get a chance to introduce themselves properly later. Deck Chief Yorasten, older, steady-handed, the one who'd end up organizing the evacuation lanes. A slight, fast-moving security private named Cade Asen who couldn't have been out of training more than a season. And 3 others whose names she would only ever learn from Themys's own mouth afterward, because two of them would not live long enough to tell her themselves. Wright Vantor. The lead corvette's frill was a hard, flat gray Mara hadn't catalogued yet. She'd learn later it meant something close to exhausted disbelief. "You did this." "The human did this," Isk said without hesitation, without the faintest attempt to claim credit that wasn't his, and Mara felt something shift in her chest at that small but real. The first time in 8 days a corvette had told the truth about her to another corvette without being asked. "Sergeant Coral Themis, ship security. She bought us the corridor. Whatever you were running from, it just lost its fastest route to the bridge." Themis looked at Mara the way she imagined a soldier looked at a piece of unfamiliar ordnance. Not quite trust, not quite suspicion, something wary and recalculating in between. "The captain's directive is armed. We have 35 minutes before this ship stops existing, and V. Horace holds the only launch bays with pods enough for the crew still alive." "Then that's not our fight," Mara said. "Getting people to pods is your job, and you're better at it than we are. Ours is stopping the clock." She held up the slate, the counter ticking visibly in the corner of its display, and watched 5 sets of alien eyes fix on the number with an intensity that needed no translation. "Shadorl gave me diagnostic authority and told me the throne might listen to grip and pressure over blood. I don't know if that's true. I know it's the only plan on this ship right now that isn't evacuate and hope V. Horace doesn't catch the pods with the flagship's own guns. Which, if he keeps the hollow crown intact long enough to use them, is exactly what he's going to do to anyone who runs." Themis's frill didn't answer with color this time. It went rigid, motionless, which Mara had already learned was the corvette equivalent of a held breath, a species thinking with its whole body instead of its face. "You would need the bridge deck. V. Horace has 30 of his best there, minimum, guarding the one prize that makes this mutiny worth the blood he's already spent on it." "I know. You would not survive it." "I know that too." Mara looked at the counter, 34 minutes. "But if nobody tries, the number on this slate hits 0 whether I'm brave about it or not, and I would rather spend the last half hour of my life doing something with my hands than sitting in an escape pod listening for the bang." She looked at Themis, then at the 4 security crew flanking him, hollow-eyed and blood-marked and clearly out of any plan of their own. "You want to spend it differently, that's your right. But if any of you know a faster way up that isn't through 30 boarders' front door, now's the time to say so." For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Themis's frill flushed a slow, deliberate blue grief's color. Mara now understood, but also something else layered under it, something closer to resolve, and he checked the charge indicator on his weapon with the flat competence of a soldier who had already decided. "There is a way," he said. "It is not fast and it is not safe, and it will not get all of us there alive, but it is faster than 30 minutes of front door." He looked past her at Isk, and something passed between the two corvettes that Mara couldn't read and didn't try to. "The old Ascension processional, a ritual corridor, sealed since before my commission, running the spine of the ship from the lower observation gallery to the throne approach. No one guards a corridor, no one remembers exists. You remember it. I stood honor guard there once, as a cadet, the day Shadorl took the throne from her predecessor. Something moved through Themis's frill that wasn't grief and wasn't resolve, something older and more private, and he didn't explain it, and Mara didn't ask. Follow me. And human, whatever you intend to do with that throne when you reach it, I hope Shadorl was right to trust you, because in 29 minutes it will no longer be a question anyone gets to ask twice." They moved. 29 minutes became 26, became 21 in a run through corridors Mara would never afterward be able to describe in the right order. A gallery of dark viewports showing stars smeared by the ship's evasive maneuvering. A stairwell that Themis's people cleared with 3 shots each, precise and economical, no wasted motion, no wasted mercy either. A moment where the youngest of the security crew, a corvette barely out of what Mara guessed was their equivalent of adolescence, took a graze across the shoulder plate, and kept moving without breaking stride because there was no time left in the universe to stop for it. It was in the stairwell that the ship's general address cut in again. No longer the flat translated surrender demand, but a voice Mara hadn't heard yet, Corvith native and furious and close enough to raw that the translator struggled to keep pace with it. Fleet-marshal Vihor Kelra to all boarding elements. A human is loose aboard my ship and has cost me a full company at the cargo junction. I want it found. I want it found before it reaches anything that matters. And if any of you are foolish enough to think a species that could not survive an afternoon on Corvith soil poses a threat to this vessel, you are welcome to explain that miscalculation to me personally, once I have finished explaining mine to the Ascendancy Council. Themys's frill flickered something close to grim amusement. He knows your name isn't in that. He's more afraid of you than he's saying. He should be, Isk said quietly, and for a Wright who had spent the conversation admitting his caste didn't matter in wars, there was an edge in it Mara hadn't heard from him yet. He denied my whole caste a claim right for a decade because he could not afford witnesses who understood machines better than he understood killing. Now the machine understands something he does not, and it is wearing the shape of the one kind of threat his doctrine never trained him to see. They lost 2 of Themys's people at the processional corridor's far end, where a border patrol caught the tail of their run and traded fire in a stairwell too narrow for anything but attrition. Mara didn't watch that part, made herself keep moving, because watching wouldn't save them and moving might save what was left. It was Cade Asen who bought the extra 10 seconds that got the rest of them through, the private barely out of training, plate scored from 3 separate grazes already, who planted himself at the stairwell's throat and screamed something at the boarders behind them that needed no translation. A young voice doing the oldest job a soldier's voice had ever done, buying time with noise because he had nothing else left to spend. Mara heard the moment his voice stopped. She didn't look back to confirm it. She had already learned, in one very long hour, exactly what looking back cost and exactly what it bought, and the answer to both was nothing that helped the people still moving. 19 minutes when they reached the base of the last stairwell. 16 when Themis held up a fist and the whole group went still, flattened against a bulkhead 30 meters short of a blast door that hummed with active shielding and stood open exactly wide enough for the shapes of at least a dozen boarders visible on the other side, weapons trained down the approach, waiting for precisely the kind of desperate rush a dying ship's loyalists might attempt. That is the throne approach, Themis breathed. 16 minutes human and 30 seconds of it just went to me telling you the truth. We cannot take that door, not the 5 of us. Not with anything short of the whole security complement I no longer have. Mara looked at the door, at the shapes beyond it, at the counter ticking down on the slate in her hand, and felt something in her that was not despair and was not fear, but was instead the particular, familiar click of a problem rearranging itself into a shape she recognized. The exact feeling she got staring at an engine everyone else had already called dead, the half-second before she found the one thing nobody else had thought to check. "You don't need to take it," she said. "You need it open for 11 seconds from the inside, with everyone on the other side looking somewhere else." Isk's frill went very still. "You have a way to do that. I've been reading this ship's guts for 40 minutes, and it keeps telling me the same thing everywhere I look." Mara turned the slate over, checking the schematic she'd pulled from the cargo junction, cross-referencing it against the corridor layout Themis had led them through. Every system on this ship assumes the person breaking in wants through a door. Nobody built a defense against someone who doesn't want through the door at all. They want the air on the other side of it. You intend to vent the throne approach. I intend to make Vihorez's people believe, for 11 seconds, that the throne approach is about to be vented, long enough for every one of them to do exactly what any soldier alive does when a hull breach alarm screams in their ear, which is look at the nearest bulkhead seal instead of the door in front of them. She was already moving toward a junction box half hidden behind a support strut, the twin to a dozen others she'd passed in the last hour. It won't fool a machine. It only has to fool people for 11 seconds, and people flinch at the same alarm whether they're born on Aldergate or hatched in the Ascendancy. That's not a design flaw in your ship, Themis. That's just what it costs to be a person, standing next to a wall you're not sure will hold. 14 minutes. Isk was already crouched beside her at the junction box, tools out, translating her half-formed plan into the specific sequence of Corvith alarm architecture that would sell the lie. And for the first time since the blast door had blown open on her cell, Mara Voss let herself believe. Not that they would win, not yet. That was a different and much larger thing to believe. But that in the next 90 seconds, for the first time all night, the ship itself was about to do exactly what she told it to do, and nobody standing on the other side of that door had the faintest idea it was coming. The alarm hit at the 90-second mark exactly. A shrieking three-tone klaxon Isk swore was reserved for imminent hull failure, and it did what Mara had promised it would do. Every one of the dozen boarders visible through the blast door flinched toward the nearest bulkhead seal in the same half-second, weapons dropping from the corridor to search the ceiling and deck plates for the breach that wasn't there. And in that half-second, Themis's remaining people came through the gap low and fast and merciless. 3 shots each, the specific economy of soldiers who had run out of any reason to hold back. It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was clean. 2 boarders got shots off before they went down, and one of Themis's people took a round to the leg and kept firing anyway, screaming something in the subsonic register that needed no translation at all. Mara stayed back exactly as long as discipline let her, and not 1 second longer, then went through the door behind them because the thrown approach beyond it was not, it turned out, empty. A second rank of boarders had been staged in an alcove 20 meters further in, and they were already turning. Down, Isk's hand closed on her shoulder and hauled her sideways into a support column shadow as fire raked the space she'd been standing in. 12 minutes. She could feel the countdown now less as a number on a slate and more as a physical pressure behind her sternum, a held breath she couldn't release until it was over one way or another. Themis went down covering the flank, not killed. She saw him drag himself upright against the column, one arm useless, still firing left-handed with the flat, unhurried aim of a soldier who had decided pain was a problem for later, and 2 more of his people bought the last stretch of corridor with their bodies between the boarders' guns and the throne approach's final door. A heavy blast hatch scored with the same coiled sigil she'd seen on the very first patrol that passed her cell. Except here it had been carved deep and formal into the metal itself, generations old, the mark of whoever had built this ship to answer to exactly 1 hand at a time. Mara would learn afterward that one of the 2 was Deck Chief Yora Sten, the steady-handed woman who'd been sorting evacuation lanes 20 minutes earlier with the calm of someone who expected to see the far side of the night, and that she did not, in the end, see it. And that she had spent the last clear-headed seconds of her life making sure a corridor stayed open for a species her Ascendancy had spent generations telling her didn't deserve the air it was fighting to keep breathing. Mara did not know that yet, in the moment. She only knew the corridor held, and that holding it had cost something she would owe for the rest of however long she lived. Go, Themis's voice cracked through the gunfire, Corvith native this time, no translator lag, and she understood it anyway from the shape of the sound alone. Go, human, we hold here. She went. Isk went with her, one hand dragging her the last 10 meters by the sleeve because her legs had gone momentarily numb with an adrenaline she didn't have time to feel, and the 2 of them hit the final hatch together, breathing hard, alone for the first time since the cargo junction, Themis and what remained of his people fighting a rearguard action in the smoke behind them that Mara made herself not turn around to watch, because turning around wouldn't save them and reaching the throne might. 11 minutes. The hatch was sealed, no visible control, nothing but smooth dark alloy and that same carved sigil at its center. There is no lock here to pick, Isk said, breathing hard, checking the readout on his interlock key with hands that were, for the first time all night, less than perfectly steady. This door does not open for anyone who is not already recognized by the ship, not Wrights, not security. Only the throne itself on the other side deciding to let someone in. Mara pressed her palm flat against the cold alloy, feeling for a seam, a diagnostic port, anything her hands recognized, and found nothing. A door built. She understood now, not to be broken but to be irrelevant, because nobody who mattered was ever supposed to be standing on this side of it without already having the ship's blessing. Shadoral's slate. Diagnostic authority. She said it would open doors that would otherwise kill me for trying. This is not that kind of door. Then it's the wrong kind of problem. She turned the slate over in her hands, thinking the way she thought over a dead engine, refusing the shape of the problem everyone else had already agreed on. 10 minutes. You said the throne reads pressure signature through a grip manifold. If this door only opens from the far side at the throne's command, then whoever's sitting in that throne right now can already open it, which means somebody's in there, which means this isn't a locked door. It's a held door. Isk's frill flared gold-white, the color she now understood with total certainty. Men, I had not thought of that, and I am afraid you are right. V. Horace, or one of his people, keeping the seat warm until he gets here. Mara looked at the door, at the carved sigil, at 9 minutes and 40 seconds ticking down in the corner of a dying captain's slate, and felt the last of her hesitation burn away into something harder and steadier, the specific cold clarity she'd only ever felt twice before in her life, once with a wrench in her hand and her mother's blood on the deck plates, and once with a fuel line 2 centimeters from a tithe cutter's ignition coil. Then we don't pick this lock. We make whoever's holding it open the door themselves. What she did next, she would explain to exactly one person afterward in exactly one sentence, because there was no way to make it sound like anything other than what it was. She screamed. Not for show. She threw her whole voice into the door, raw and desperate and utterly convincing, because underneath the performance every word was true, screamed that the throne approach was breached, that borders were through, that whoever held the bridge needed to open the hatch now or lose it. And she screamed it in the flat, badly accented Corvith phrases Isk fed her under his breath in the 3 seconds it took her to draw the breath. Phrases scavenged from 8 days of listening to guards who thought she couldn't understand them. It shouldn't have worked. She knew, even as she did it, that it shouldn't have worked, that any disciplined soldier on the other side of that door would have checked a monitor, confirmed a threat, done any one of a dozen things that would have exposed a human throat trying to fake a Corvith officer's panic through 6 centimeters of alloy. But the ship behind that door had been fighting a mutiny for the better part of an hour, was down to its captain dead or dying, and a scuttle clock nobody had found a way to stop. And the voice that answered from the far side, young, Mara thought, young and strung tight as a wire, did not stop to check anything at all. The hatch cracked open on a boarder barely older than the youngest of Themys's people, weapon half raised, already turning toward the breach he'd been told was coming, and finding, instead of a wave of loyalist counterattackers, one exhausted human standing perfectly still in the gap with both hands empty and visible, and Isk Vantor's reactor interlock key already jammed into the door's exposed mechanism, where the boarder's own body had, for one crucial half-second, blocked it from view. The half-second was enough. Isk wrenched the key hard, forcing the hatch's manual override past whatever hold V. Horace's people had locked onto it, and the door groaned wide open on the bridge of the hollow crown, a vast, dim, starlit chamber ringed with dead consoles and live ones, a dozen boarders scattered across it in defensive positions, and at its center, raised on a dais of the same dark alloy as the hatch, a command throne that Mara understood, the instant she laid eyes on it, was not a chair at all but a mechanism. Black and organic-looking, veined with faint threads of cold blue light that pulsed once, slow, like something breathing. Nobody was sitting in it. It sat empty in the middle of the fight, Waiting. The way it had apparently been waiting since Shadorl had last risen from it hours ago to die in a corridor 2 decks below. And every corvette on that bridge, boarders and the 2 or 3 loyalists still fighting a losing retreat around the flanking consoles, turned at the sound of the hatch to see who had just walked through a door that should have killed them for trying. 8 minutes. Mara Voss looked across a bridge full of armed strangers at an empty throne that was the only thing standing between everyone in this fight and the ship dying under all of them at once, and started walking toward it before anyone had finished deciding whether to shoot. Nobody did, not at first. That was its own kind of answer. A dozen weapons half raised, and not one of them fired, because a lone unarmed human walking calmly across a battlefield toward an empty chair was not a shape any of Vihorez's doctrine had trained them to recognize as a threat worth the round. She watched 2 of them actually lower their aim entirely, frills flushing that same pale, dismissive amber she'd learned in her cell meant not a threat, not worth it, and understood, with a clarity that would have been funny in any other minute of her life, that the very thing the corvette had jailed her for, being small, being soft, being obviously nothing like them, was the only reason she was still walking. A boarder officer nearer the dais broke the spell first, barking an order in the deep register, and the amber readings around the bridge started curdling toward something more alert. Isk moved to intercept the nearest of them, putting his own body between Mara and the first raised weapon with a Wright's total lack of combat training and a Wright's total refusal to let that stop him, and took a graze across the ribs for it that folded him half over without dropping him. "Go," he managed, echoing Themis's word from 2 minutes and a lifetime ago. "I am not the one this ship needs at that chair." Somewhere to her left, a loyalist private she would never learn the name of stepped into the gap the boarder officer's shot had been aimed through, and did not get back up. Mara didn't stop moving. She couldn't have said in that moment whether that was courage or simply the arithmetic of a countdown that no longer left room for grief to land. Only that she understood, with total clarity, exactly what this walk to the throne was costing people who had never once been asked if the price was fair. She went. 6 steps, 5, the throne's cold blue veins pulsing faster now, as if the ship itself had noticed her closing the distance and didn't know yet what to make of it. She put both hands on the arms of it, not sitting, not yet just contact, palms flat against alloy that was warmer than it had any right to be, warm the way a held tool was warm from someone else's grip, and felt, under her palms, the faintest resistance give way to the faintest yield, a lock testing a key it had never been shown before. 7 minutes. The interface that lit along the throne's inner curve wasn't a screen so much as a pressure map, a lattice of raised nodes that responded to grip the way a musical instrument responded to a hand that already knew the fingering. Except Mara didn't know the fingering, had never touched anything like it in her life, and had perhaps 4 minutes to learn a language built by an empire that had never once imagined a human hand attempting to speak it. She thought of Isk's words in the cargo junction. The machine does not care who built it. It cares who understands it. She thought of her mother's palm lock, 3 break-ins, the exact sequence of pressure and release that fooled a system built to read intent instead of identity. She thought about pressure gauges, about the specific dishonesty of every machine that claimed to want a key when what it actually wanted was a pattern, and she started pressing. The first sequence failed, the throne's veins flaring an angry violet before subsiding. The second failed too, faster, a rejection so immediate it felt almost insulted. For half a heartbeat, kneeling with both hands on an alien machine that had every reason in the universe to reject her, Mara was younger again, wrist deep in a coolant manifold with her mother's blood soaking warm through the knee of her coveralls. Her mother's voice gone thin and instructional even through the pain. Feel where it fights you, not where it lets you in. The lies always in the second one, steady clear through to the end, because that was the only inheritance her mother had ever had to leave her. Years of hands that had never once panicked in front of a dying machine. Mara had buried her 4 days later and gone back to the tug within the week, because grief was a luxury item on Aldergate, and the ice halls didn't stop needing an engineer just because hers had run out of time. She had never told anyone how much of every steady thing she'd done, since then was just her mother's hands, borrowed. 6 minutes. Somewhere behind her she heard boots, a lot of boots, moving fast, and Isk's voice, ragged, shouting something in Corvith that needed no translation because the shape of it was unmistakably a warning. She didn't turn around. Turning around wouldn't save the clock. Working would. The third sequence, heavier on the outer nodes, lighter on the inner ones, the pattern of a hand accustomed to gripping something that fought back. The pattern the captain's own dying hand had probably used 10,000 times without ever once thinking about it caught. Not fully. The throne's vein steadied to a slow, considering blue, and along its curve a schematic bloomed into being that Mara didn't need Isk to translate, because underneath the Corvith glyphs it was the same shape every ship's diagnostic tree had ever taken in her life. Systems, branches, a status she recognized instantly as asterisk partial authority granted, command lineage unconfirmed. Not command. Not yet, but a foot in a door that had been built to have no footroom at all. Purge directive, she said aloud to nobody, to herself, to the machine that might or might not be listening the way a machine listened. Show me the purge directive. The schematic answered. 5 minutes, 14 seconds, counting down in a corner of the display in numerals close enough to human ones that some deep animal part of her understood them a full second before her conscious mind caught up. Beneath the number, a lockout, the directive itself walled off behind a second, harder authentication than the one she just cracked. A wall built specifically to survive exactly the kind of half-authority she just bluffed her way into. Of course, she muttered. Of course it's not that easy. That was when Vihara's Kelra walked onto his own stolen bridge, and every boarder still standing went still the way soldiers went still around a commander. They were afraid of more than they were afraid of dying. He was bigger than any Corvith Mara had seen aboard, chitin plate scarred pale in the ritual lines she now understood, from Themys's fragments of explanation, marked formal combat, claim right won, not given. A warrior who had fought his way to every rank he carried except, apparently, the one he'd wanted most. His command plate was black shot through with crimson, no border sigil crudely stenciled but cast into the metal itself, and his frill, when it flared at the sight of a human standing at his captain's throne, when a color Mara hadn't catalogued yet and didn't need Isk to translate. Some colors needed no translator. This one was rage. You, his voice came through the general address's translator matrix even unaugmented, a bleed-through of frequency too strong for the small room to fully contain. The tithe saboteur. The cargo my own intelligence officers assured me did not matter. Funny how often that turns out wrong. Mara kept both hands on the throne, kept working the pressure lattice with the part of her attention that could spare it, because 5 minutes and change was not a number that forgave distraction, and every second she held his eyes was a second she wasn't finding the lockout seam. You should tell your intelligence officers to reconsider their whole doctrine. Might be too late for that now, though. You have found partial authority. His frill didn't fade with the observation. If anything, it deepened, and something in the set of his shoulders that Mara had learned, over one very long hour, to read as Corvith calculation shifted toward something else. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of a species recognizing a category error it had made in real time. That should be impossible. The manifold was built to reject a hand shaped wrong for it. Turns out it doesn't care about the shape, it cares about the pattern. I've spent my whole life reading patterns machines think are secret. She found a seam in the directive's lockout, a diagnostic subroutine buried 3 layers down that looked, for all its alien glyphs, exactly like the manufacturer's back door every industrial system on Aldergate had carried whether its owners knew it or not, the kind no engineer ever fully closed, because closing it meant nobody could fix the thing when it inevitably broke. 4 minutes, 11 seconds. You built a throne that reads competence instead of blood, Marshal. That was your empire's mistake, not mine. I'm just the first person in this room competence actually fit. Something shifted behind Voss's slitted eyes, a recognition Mara hadn't expected and didn't understand until he spoke again. Aldergate. He said the name the way a man said a word he'd read in a report and never expected to need. The Tithe fleet lost 11% quota from that rock last season. My own cousin commanded the collection escort. He described a saboteur his inspectors could never catch and dismissed her in his report as a rounding error not worth a marshal's attention. His frill flared deeper, the rage in it curdling into something almost like recognition. I read that report. I remember thinking my cousin a fool for spending 3 paragraphs on an insect. I find myself reconsidering. Tell your cousin the insect says hello. Mara didn't look up from the lattice, 4 minutes and falling, every part of her attention that could be spared still hunting the directive seam. And tell him next time he wants to skim a colony blind, he should budget for the possibility that somebody on the other end of his manifest actually reads machines for a living. Then I will simply remove you from the chair before your competence matters. Voss didn't shout the order. He didn't need to. 6 of his remaining boarders raised their weapons in the same motion, a wall of aimed fire between Mara and the rest of the bridge, and she understood with total clarity that the next 4 minutes were not going to be decided by how fast she could work a lock. Isk moved first, hurled himself bodily into the nearest weapons line just as it fired, taking a wound meant for the throne instead of himself, and went down hard against the dais steps in a spreading dark stain that made something in Mara's chest go cold and very, very focused. Isk. Work, he ground out, one hand pressed to his side, gold eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that cut through the pain in them. You are the only thing on this bridge that matters right now. Work. She worked 3 minutes 40 seconds. Her hands found the diagnostic seam and drove into it, not for the directive itself. That lockout was too deep, too formal, built to survive exactly this kind of desperate assault. But for something adjacent, something the ship's designers had never imagined needing to wall off separately because no one sane would ever have thought to use it this way. The dais's own structural safety protocol, the emergency ejection system built to ivory tower a damaged command module clear of a dying ship rather than let it drag the rest of the crew down with it. A system built to save the throne, not the man sitting in it. Voss's boarders closed the last of the distance, weapons rising toward point-blank range, and Mara Voss, 3 minutes and change on a countdown that would kill everyone in this room regardless of who won the next 10 seconds, inverted the dais's local grav plating exactly the way she'd inverted 11 tons of ore concentrate an hour and a lifetime ago, and dropped the floor out from under 6 boarders and 1 fleet-marshal in the same half-second. It wasn't a fall so much as a slam, gravity flipping hard enough to throw armored bodies into the overhead in a spray of dropped weapons and shattered composite paneling. And in the 2-second window, while a dozen Corvith fought their own inner ears for basic orientation, the surviving loyalist officers flanking the bridge's far consoles did what soldiers did with a 2-second window. They took it. The fight that followed was short and ugly, and nothing like the clean reversals Mara had half expected from every story she'd ever half listened to as a kid. Loyalists and stunned boarders grappling at close range, in a room with the gravity still recovering, someone screaming, someone else laughing in the particular, unhinged way people laughed when they were sure they were about to die and were furious to find out they weren't yet. One of the loyalist officers, the woman with the torn shoulder guard Mara would only later learn was named Vex Sauron, a comms specialist who had picked up a fallen boarder's weapon, because her own station had been destroyed an hour earlier, and she'd refused every suggestion that she retreat instead of fight, put down two of V. Horace's remaining soldiers with the flat, joyless efficiency of someone who had spent the whole night waiting for a chance to do something other than watch people she knew die around her. It was not heroism in the way half-remembered childhood stories promised heroism looked. It was exhaustion finally finding a target, and Mara understood, watching it happen in her peripheral vision while her hands stayed locked on the lattice, that this was probably closer to the truth of every fight anyone had ever called heroic, stripped of the version that got told afterward. Mara didn't watch most of it, couldn't afford to. 2 minutes 50. She was back inside the lockout seam, chasing the last authentication wall between her hands and a scuttled reactor, when a weight slammed into the dais steps beside her, and a hand closed around her wrist hard enough to grind bone. V. Horace had found his footing faster than any of them. His frill had gone past rage into something colder, something that Mara understood belatedly, uselessly, was the exact look of a warrior who had decided the fight for the ship no longer mattered nearly as much as making sure the human who'd humiliated him didn't live to see how it ended. 2 minutes, he said, close enough that she could feel the subsonic register of it in her own chest. Perhaps less. I have fought 100 claim right challenges for less honor than dying with my hand on this throat, human. Then you should have spent less time fighting for honor and more time reading your own ship's manuals. Mara didn't try to pull free. Pulling free was a fight she'd lose in half a second against 4 extra joints and twice her mass. Instead, her free hand found, by feel alone, the exact node cluster she'd been building toward for the last 90 seconds, the ejection protocol's manual trigger, built into the dais itself for the one scenario its designers had actually anticipated. A commander choosing to save the throne rather than die in it. You want my hand on this chair so badly. Have it. She slapped his gauntleted fist, still locked around her wrist flat against the pressure lattice, driving his own grip into the exact sequence she just spent 2 minutes teaching herself to fake. A sequence that read, to a throne built to recognize pattern over blood, not as V. Horace Kelra's authority, but as an unrecognized, hostile, unauthorized hand forcing contact against active resistance. Precisely the condition the ejection protocol had been built to answer. The dais didn't hesitate. Alloy plating she hadn't even known was a hatch dropped away beneath V. Horace's feet, and gravity, still recovering, still raw and unstable from her first trick, did the rest, taking him down through the throne's service chute in a single violent motion that tore his grip from her wrist and left her standing alone at the lattice with her own hand finally, entirely, uncontested. 1 minute 40. Somewhere below, a heavy containment hatch cycled shut on the sound of a fleet-marshal's fury, sealed into a maintenance crawlspace 3 decks down that Mara made a mental note, distantly, to have someone let him out of eventually. Not yet. Not with a minute and change left on the only number that mattered. She put both hands back on the throne, no longer stealing a stranger's grip, no longer faking a pattern she didn't own, and felt the lattice answer her, fully, this time, the schematic blooming wide open across the dais in a cascade of Corvith glyphs and raw system architecture that resolved, underneath all of it, into the same plain diagnostic truth every dying machine had ever told her. Here is what is broken. Here is how to stop it. The Purge directive's final authentication wall didn't fall to a trick this time. It fell because Mara Voss, for the first time since Shadorl had pressed a data slate into her hand and told her not to do this slowly, had exactly what the system had been built to require. Total, uncontested working command of every system the throne could reach, earned in the only currency that had ever meant anything to her, knowing the machine better than the people who'd built it thought a stranger ever could. 41 seconds. The reactor core's scuttle countdown froze, flickered, and reversed itself into a long green diagnostic hold that Mara didn't fully trust until she watched the number vanish from the display entirely, replaced by a status line in careful, deliberate Corvith script that the throne itself, for reasons she would never fully understand and never stopped being grateful for, rendered into flat, functional translation across every screen still live on the bridge. Command authority reassigned, purge directive rescinded, hollow crown answers. Nobody on the bridge moved for a long moment. The fighting had guttered out somewhere in the last 90 seconds without Mara fully registering when boarders disarmed or down, loyalist officers standing over them with weapons that had gone from firing to merely pointed, and every set of gold Corvith eyes still capable of looking anywhere was looking at her. She didn't let herself sit down in the throne. That felt obscurely like the wrong gesture for the moment, not a coronation, not a claim, just a hand still resting on a machine that had finally, for reasons she suspected she would spend years trying to fully understand, decided to answer her. She knelt instead, dropping fast to Isk's side where he'd slumped against the dais steps, one hand still pressed hard to the wound at his ribs, frill gone a pale, exhausted gray that made her chest tighten with a fear that had nothing to do with countdowns. Hey, she got an arm under him, checking the wound the way she'd checked 100 injuries on Aldergate's docks, pressure and color, and how fast the bleeding was actually moving. Bad, but not the kind of bad that had already decided anything. Hey, look at me. Stay with it. I am staying with it. His voice came thin but steady, a Wright's flat competence even now. You stopped the clock. We stopped the clock. She looked up, found the nearest loyalist officer, a woman with a torn shoulder guard and a stripe of dried black blood down one side of her face, and didn't have to explain herself twice. He needs a medic. Now, whatever's left of your infirmary, whoever's left to run it. The officer hesitated exactly 1 second, gold eyes flicking to the throne, to the dais, to the human kneeling on it giving orders like she'd been born to a bridge instead of a docking bay. And then moved, barking commands to 2 others who lifted Isk between them with the sudden, unhesitating care Mara had learned Corvith reserved for their own wounded, and had not expected, until this exact moment, to see extended to the reason he'd been wounded protecting. Themis came in 4 minutes later, dragged between 2 of his surviving people, one leg a ruin, alive against every reasonable expectation Mara had carried out of that stairwell. He found her at the throne's base, working the pressure lattice with both hands to push a ship-wide broadcast through every remaining active channel, and his frill, even through the pain etched across every line of him, flushed a color she recognized now without needing to think about it. Not grief, not quite triumph either. Something in between that she suspected didn't have a clean human word any more than half of what she'd learned tonight did. You held, she said. You arrived. He let himself be lowered against the dais steps, breathing hard, and looked past her at the throne's slow blue pulse with an expression she couldn't fully read. Shadorl used to say the hollow crown chose its captains as much as the ascension ceremony ever did. I did not think I would live to see her proven right by a species we tax for daring to build their own engines. I'm not your captain, Sergeant. No, something almost like humor moved through the exhaustion on his face. At the moment, human, you are considerably more than that, and every officer left alive on this bridge is aware of it whether they enjoy the fact or not. The broadcast went out shipwide at her direction a minute later, translated by the throne itself into a dozen dialects she didn't understand, and one flat, functional rendering she did. Purge directive rescinded. Fleet-marshal Vhora's Kelra's mutiny has failed. All boarding elements are ordered to stand down and surrender to the nearest loyalist authority. This order comes from the throne. She hadn't decided in advance to let the ship itself carry the weight of that last sentence instead of her own name. But standing there with her hand still on the lattice, watching resistance, reports flicker out across the ship deck by deck over the following 20 minutes as isolated pockets of boarders laid down their weapons, rather than keep fighting a battle their own commander's throne had just declared over. She understood it had been the right call. An order from a name nobody trusted, yet was a suggestion. An order from the hollow crown itself was something else entirely. It took the better part of an hour to fully secure the ship, and Mara spent most of it exactly where she'd earned the right to be, moving through the wreckage with Themys's remaining people and the loyalist crew who emerged, deck by deck, from wherever they'd hidden or fought or bled, directing repair priorities with the same flat competence she'd have used clearing a haul route through a debris field, because a warship this size didn't stop needing an engineer's eye just because the shooting had stopped. She found, more than once, a Corvette technician staring at her the way Isk had stared at her in that ruined control alcove, recalculating, in real time, everything they'd assumed about what a human hand could or couldn't be trusted to do. Somewhere in that hour she found Pell again, or rather Pell found her, materializing out of a knot of provisioner-cast crew ferrying ration crates toward the makeshift infirmary that had swallowed most of Deck 9, small and quick and no longer quite so wide-eyed, though the fear hadn't fully drained out of her frill, and Mara suspected it wouldn't for a long while yet. The girl didn't approach. She stopped 10 meters off, holding a crate half her own body weight, and simply watched Mara direct 2 Wrights through a jury-rigged patch on a ruptured coolant line with the same flat competence she'd have used on Aldergate. And then, before anyone could stop her or translate for her, set the crate down, cross the distance at a dead run, and press something small and warm into Mara's hand before darting back to her work detail without waiting for a reaction. It was a ration wafer, the good kind, the kind Mara had learned in 8 days of prison food was reserved for crew and never once offered to cargo. Mara didn't eat it. She put it in her jacket pocket next to Shadoral's slate, and didn't examine too closely why her throat had gone tight over a piece of pressed protein a child had decided she'd earned. Not every wounded body pulled from the cargo junction's wreckage wore loyalist gray. 6 of Vihorez's boarders had survived the collapse Mara engineered, broken but breathing under 2 meters of ore concentrate, and when the loyalist crew freeing them from the wreckage hesitated over what to do with enemies who'd have shot them an hour earlier without a second thought, it was Mara who settled the argument before it properly started. Get them to the infirmary. Same cue as everyone else, not the back of it. She said it flatly, already moving on to the next problem, but she meant it enough that Themis, watching from 6 meters off with his own wounds barely dressed, filed the moment away the way he'd learned to file everything about her that surprised him. I collapsed a corridor on them to stop a war, not to finish one for them. There's a difference, and I intend to keep being the person who remembers it, even when it'd be easier not to. One of the 6, a boarder young enough that Mara guessed he'd barely finished whatever passed for basic training, frill flickering through fear and confusion in roughly equal measure as a medic worked a splint around a shattered leg, asked her, through Isk, why she'd bothered. Because somebody probably lied to you about what tonight was for, Mara told him, crouching to his eye level the way she had for Pell, the way she suspected she was going to keep doing for every frightened young thing this ship put in front of her from now on. Vihorez needed soldiers who'd believe his doctrine without asking too many questions about it, and you were exactly young enough to be handed that doctrine before you'd had the chance to argue with it. That's not the same as choosing it. You get a second chance to choose, starting whenever that leg heals. Try to pick better next time. He didn't answer. His frill, when Isk translated it for her later, had gone a color neither of them had a clean name for, something between shame and the first flicker of a question he hadn't let himself ask before tonight. She found the captain an hour after that, in a service alcove 2 decks below where she'd left her, not dead, though close enough to it that the medic crouched over her had the particular stillness of someone managing an ending rather than fighting one. Shadoral's gold eyes tracked to Mara's face the moment she crossed the threshold, and something in the ruin of her frill flickered, weak but unmistakable, into the pale gold-white Mara had learned meant surprise too large for a dying body to properly express. You disarmed it, the captain said. It wasn't a question. The ship's own systems had clearly told her before Mara had a chance to. With about 40 seconds left, wanted more of a margin honestly. Mara knelt beside her, the way she'd knelt beside Isk, the way she suspected she was going to spend a great deal of the rest of her life kneeling beside wounded people on this ship. "Your throne." It listened. It has always listened. Shadoral's voice had gone to almost nothing, the translator struggling to find enough signal to render it at all. Every captain who ever sat it told themselves it was blood, or rank, or the weight of an ascension ceremony that took days to perform correctly. I sat it for 11 years and never once believed that. I believed it listened to whoever understood it best in the moment it needed understanding, and I built my whole command around making sure that was always me. A ragged breath, the medic's hand tightening on her wrist in a gesture Mara understood without needing it explained not long now. I did not expect it to be a human. I confess I am glad it was. Horas would have made it a weapon. You made it a door. I had a good teacher for about 90 seconds. Mara meant the pressure lattice. She suspected, from the way the captain's frill moved, that Shadoral had heard something else in it. The medics say you might. Do not. Not unkind, just final. The specific patience of someone who had already made her peace with a number and didn't want it disturbed. I bought 58 minutes so that a mutiny would cost more than it was worth. I did not buy them expecting to spend them myself. Do not let anyone build me into more than I was human. I was a captain who loved a ship more than the empire that owned it, and for one very long night that was enough. Her eyes found Mara's one more time, steady even now, even here. Take care of my crew, all of them. Not only the ones who fought. She died 40 minutes later, with Mara 3 decks up elbow deep in a coolant patch and unable to be there for it. And when the word reached her second hand through a Wright too young to know how to soften bad news, Mara sat down hard on an equipment case in the middle of a half-repaired junction and let herself feel it for exactly 90 seconds before she made herself stand back up, because Shadoral had asked her for one thing with the last clear breath she had. And grieving properly was a debt Mara intended to pay in full later, once there was time that wasn't owed to someone still alive. Isk found her there. He'd been stitched and dosed with whatever passed for field anesthetic in Corvith medical stores, moving slow and careful with one arm strapped tight to his side, and he didn't say anything about her face when he sat down on the case beside her, just let the silence hold for a while before he spoke. Horas did not mutiny for ambition alone, he said eventually, when she'd have believed he was only there to keep her company. I have spent the last hour listening to what his surviving officers say when they think no one important is nearby. He believed Shadoral too soft on the frontier worlds, too slow to punish tithe defaults, too quick to grant claim right hearings to castes his doctrine says should have none. He called her governance a weakness the Ascendancy could not afford in a fleet that intended to keep expanding the tithe border. He was, in his own accounting, trying to save the empire from a captain he believed was going to lose it through mercy. Isk's frill moved through something slow and considering. I tell you this not to earn him sympathy. I tell you because I think you should understand exactly what you defeated tonight was not merely a man who wanted a ship. It was a doctrine that has been quietly winning inside the Ascendancy for longer than either of us has been alive. And tonight, for the first time in longer than any Wright's memory, it lost, and it lost to the exact kind of person it insisted could never matter. Mara turned the ration wafer over in her jacket pocket without taking it out, thinking about a 19-year-old girl's terrified frill in a crawlway, about a dead captain's last request, about a doctrine that had built an entire empire's manners around deciding in advance whose competence was allowed to count. Then maybe it's due a longer losing streak. Perhaps, something almost like a smile moved through Isk's exhaustion. You should know Themis is asking for you. He is refusing the medic's recommendation that he rest, on the grounds that there is a fleet inbound and someone competent needs to be standing beside you when it arrives. I told him you did not require guarding. He informed me, and I quote, that he was not talking about protecting you from the fleet. He was talking about making sure the fleet understood, from the first word out of anyone's mouth, Exactly how many of his people had died, proving you were worth listening to. Mara found Themis 20 minutes later exactly where Isk had promised, propped against a console on the bridge with his ruined leg splinted and elevated, and a data slate balanced on his good knee, already compiling, in the flat, methodical shorthand of a soldier building a case he intended to win, a casualty log, a timeline, and a list of names. He looked up when she approached and didn't stop working. "You're Asten," he said without preamble, tapping the slate. "Deck Chief, 22 years service. Cade Asen, security private, 4 months out of training, who held a stairwell alone for 11 seconds so the rest of us could reach the processional corridor. 3 more names I am still confirming. I am building the record now, human, while it is still fresh enough that no fleet historian gets to decide later what it meant. When the Council's overseer arrives and starts doing the arithmetic every institution does after a mutiny, how much of this can be minimized? How much blame can be spread thin enough to disappear? He is going to find that the record was already written, in detail, by the people who were there, and that it does not have room in it for the version where a human prisoner was incidental to any of this. That's not why I did it. I know precisely why you did it." Themis's frill flushed the deep, steady blue she'd learned meant grief, though there was iron under it now too. "That is exactly why I am doing this. You did it because it needed doing and you happened to be standing closest. Institutions do not know how to honor that kind of reason. They only know how to honor accounts, so I am building you one they cannot argue with." He set the slate down, meeting her eyes with the particular directness she'd first seen from him at the cargo junction, a soldier deciding, in real time, what kind of officer he intended to be for whatever came next. "The fleet will be here within the hour. When it arrives, I would like you to let me stand exactly where I am standing now. Some fights are better fought by someone who already has the scars to prove which side he was on." She didn't get to sit with that promise for long. Deeper into the repair effort, with the worst of the fires out and the dead being carried to a cold storage bay nobody wanted to talk about directly, one of the Wrights running structural diagnostics on the lower decks flagged a containment fluctuation in the secondary coolant loop, feeding the very reactor Mara had just spent the worst 40 seconds of her life fighting to keep from going critical. A fluctuation that would not kill anyone in the next hour, but would, left alone, degrade into exactly the kind of slow, catastrophic failure that made engineers on Aldergate wake up in a cold sweat years after they'd stopped working the belt. Isk found her the same way he'd found the courage to trust her hours earlier, directly, without softening it. "It is not urgent. It will not kill anyone today, but it is real, and if we do not address it before the Council's escort arrives and someone official decides, an unresolved technical fault is reason enough to pull the throne out of a human's hands before the accounting is even finished. It will be solved by the book instead of by the people who actually understand this ship." His frill flickered, careful. "I would rather we solved it ourselves, quietly." Now, she understood, without him needing to spell it further, exactly what he was actually telling her, that a wounded, uncertain flagship with an unresolved technical problem and a human hand on its throne was a story someone in the Ascendancy's cautious middle ranks could use, and that the surest way to keep that story from being written was to make sure there was no unresolved problem left for anyone to point at. They worked the coolant loop for close to 2 hours, she and Isk and 2 more Wrights who'd lost their whole shift crew to the mutiny and had nowhere else they wanted to be, tracing the fluctuation back through a manifold that had, it turned out, been quietly failing since long before Vhoraz's borders ever breached the hull. A decade of deferred maintenance the old command structure had never prioritized. Because a Wright's requisition for parts had always ranked behind a border officer's requisition for anything at all, Mara recognized the shape of the problem the instant she saw the maintenance log's gaps. It was the exact shape of every corner Aldergate's own overworked, underfunded tug fleet had ever cut. The exact shape of every system that kept running not because anyone had planned for it to, but because somebody competent refused to let it stop. She fixed it the way she fixed everything. Methodically, without drama, 4 hands and 2 very different kinds of joints working a problem down to its actual cause instead of its symptom, until the coolant loop's readings settled into a flat, boring, entirely trustworthy stability that made Isk's frill flush a color she'd have called relief in a human. Somewhere in the middle of it, elbow-deep in a manifold not so different in principle from the one that had killed her mother, she found herself explaining pressure differential math to a Wright half again her size in the same patient, unhurried cadence her mother had used explaining it to her. Years and one dead woman, and an entire species removed from the lesson's original classroom, and didn't examine too closely why that made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the long shift. "Your empire builds better ships than it maintains," she told Isk afterward, wiping her hands on a rag that had been white a decade ago. "That's not an insult, it's a diagnosis. Every failure I've found tonight traces back to somebody choosing prestige over upkeep, and that's not a Corvith problem, that's an everybody problem. My mother used to say a fleet that forgets its rights is a fleet that's already sinking, it just hasn't noticed the water yet. Your mother sounds as though she would have made an excellent Wright. She'd have hated the caste system, loved the work." Mara looked at the readout, steady and green and entirely unremarkable, the best possible outcome for hours of unglamorous labor nobody but the people in this room would ever know had happened. "That's most of what I've learned about your people tonight, Isk. Half your problems aren't your people. They're what your people were told they weren't allowed to fix." Somewhere between the coolant loop and the structural check, her body finally sent the bill for the last several hours. She found herself sitting on the edge of the dais with a ration Barpel had produced from somewhere pressed insistently into her hand, and no memory of having decided to sit down at all, just Isk's voice, gentle and firm in the way she suspected he reserved for exactly this kind of stubbornness, telling her that a throne that had waited generations for the right hand could wait another 6 minutes for that hand to eat something. She ate it. Her hands, she noticed, hadn't stopped shaking since the coolant loop, a fine tremor she'd mistaken for cold until she understood it was simply what a body did after running on nothing but adrenaline and the specific stubborn refusal to fall over for the better part of a full day. 6 minutes. She let herself have them, sitting on cold alloy in a bridge full of strangers who were slowly, deck by deck, becoming something closer to a crew, and then she stood back up, because 6 minutes was the only rest a job this size was ever going to offer her, and she'd learned a long time ago on Aldergate not to expect more than that from any night's work. She was back at the throne, running a structural integrity check on the deck she'd collapsed under the borders, when the sensors lit with a contact that made every loyalist officer within earshot go very still. "Fleet signature," the injured officer with the torn shoulder guard reported, voice tight. "Council Enforcement Squadron. 6 vessels closing fast. They will have picked up the distress beacon the moment the mutiny began. Ascendancy protocol, marshal rank incursion, full-strength response." Themis, propped against a console with a field dressing wrapped tight around his ruined leg, met Mara's eyes across the bridge. "They are not coming to negotiate. They are coming to reclaim a stolen flagship from whoever currently holds it, and their doctrine will not have prepared them, any more than V. Horace's did, for what they are about to find sitting in the one place they left no room in their protocols for a stranger to be." Mara looked at the sensor plot, at 6 warship signatures bearing down on a vessel she had, less than 2 hours ago, been locked in a cage aboard as cargo not worth a guard's second glance, and felt something settle in her that was steadier than fear and steadier, even, than triumph. It was the particular calm of a person who had already done the hardest thing the night had to offer, and understood that everything after it was simply the next problem, worked the same way as the last one. "Then let's give them something worth finding," she said, "instead of something worth fighting." The enforcement squadron's flag officer hailed the hollow crown 20 minutes later, and the image that resolved on the bridge's main display was an older corvette in council gray, frill perfectly still, with the discipline of a lifetime spent giving orders that were never questioned, eyes narrowing with visible confusion at the sight awaiting him. He had clearly expected wreckage, or Vihorez's crimson-black plate on the throne, or at absolute worst a stalemate he could break with 6 ships' worth of firepower. He had not expected a human standing at the dais in a torn prisoner's jacket, flanked by a wounded Wright leaning on a cane improvised from a support strut, and a security sergeant who could no longer stand at all, with a captain's dying data slate still clipped to her belt, and the throne itself pulsing its slow, steady blue behind her like something that had, for the first time in longer than any record aboard could confirm, stopped waiting. "This is Fleet Overseer Kessa Drahel, Council Enforcement." His voice, even through the translator, carried the particular flatness of a man working very hard to sound like nothing had surprised him. "Identify yourself and confirm the status of Fleet-Marshal Vihorez Kelra, currently reported in mutiny against Ascendancy Command." Vihorez is sealed 3 decks down in a maintenance crawlway with a very unhappy attitude, and no way out until somebody lets him out. Mara kept her voice level, kept both hands loosely folded instead of white-knuckled on the dais rail, because she had learned enough about this species in one very long night to know that steadiness read to them, the way it read to anyone, as the truest kind of authority there was. Captain Ren Shadorl is dead. She armed the ship's purge directive rather than let the mutiny take an intact flagship, and I disarmed it with about 40 seconds to spare, because I would rather be the reason several hundred of your crew are alive than the reason they're not. The overseer's frill flickered through a rapid sequence of colors Mara still couldn't fully read, though she was starting, after everything, to recognize the general shape of a species running headlong into a category their doctrine had no shelf for. You are the human prisoner. The tithe saboteur from the frontier hearing. I'm the reason your most powerful warship isn't a debris field right now, and I'd appreciate it if the next sentence out of your mouth reflected that math instead of the paperwork that put me in a cell 8 days ago. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The throne answered me. Not your rank structure, not your claim right, not 8 generations of ascension ceremony, a pressure lattice that reads competence, and I was the only competent hand in the room when it mattered. I don't know what your protocols say about that, Overseer, because Themis here tells me there isn't a protocol. So we're going to have to work out a new one, you and I'd rather do it as 2 people who both want this ship's crew to survive the conversation than as an admiral and a piece of cargo he'd like back. The silence that followed ran long enough that Themis, watching from his place against the console, murmured something under his breath that the translator didn't catch and Mara didn't ask him to repeat. "The council will require a full accounting," Overseer Adrahel said finally, and something in the register of it had shifted, not warmth. Not yet. Mara understood she wasn't going to get warmth out of an institution in the space of one conversation, but something adjacent to it, the beginning of a calculation that no longer assumed the answer in advance. Testimony. Logs. The word of the surviving loyalist command. His gaze moved briefly to Themis, to the wounded crew visible at the edges of the display, and Mara watched him do the same arithmetic she'd watched Isk do in the ruined control alcove 2 hours and a lifetime ago. "It will not be resolved today, human. Possibly not this season. I've got nowhere else to be." She meant it, and something in her own voice surprised her with how true it came out. This ship needs a working crew and a working command structure a great deal more than it needs a fast answer, and I intend to make sure it has both until your council sends someone who can look at what happened here and treat it like the truth instead of an inconvenience. Until then, the hollow crown answers to the hand that stopped it from dying, and you're welcome to escort us back to a shipyard where your engineers can confirm every word of that themselves. Overseer Adrahel held her gaze for a long moment through the display, frills settling, finally, into a color she hadn't catalogued before, and would eventually learn meant something close to reluctant, unresolved respect. The closest thing his species had to admitting a doctrine had just failed to survive contact with a single stubborn woman from a mining colony nobody in the Ascendancy had bothered to learn the name of before today. "Escort formation," he said to someone off frame, and then to Mara in a tone that had lost most of its flatness. "You will answer to the council eventually, human. Everyone who touches that throne does. I'm counting on it." She let her hand rest one more time on the warm alloy beside her. "I'd like to see the rule that finally has to account for me." The formal transfer negotiations opened aboard the Hollow Crown's bridge, with considerably more ceremony than Mara had expected from a fleet that had, hours earlier, been prepared to reduce this ship to a debris field to settle the argument. Overseer Adrahel came aboard in person this time rather than by transmission, flanked by 2 junior officers and a legal recorder whose sole function, as far as Mara could tell, was to make certain every word spoken in this chamber existed in triplicate before the day was through. He toured the bridge with the particular careful neutrality of a man cataloging evidence for a report he had not yet decided how to write, paused longest at the dais where the throne's slow blue pulse had settled into something almost restful, and said very little for the better part of an hour while Themis and Isk walked him through the wreckage, the casualty log, and at Mara's insistence, every name on it in order, without exception. The formal transfer of custody was supposed to take an hour after that. It took considerably longer, and not for any reason Overseer Adrahel's opening transmission had prepared her for. It began as a discrepancy so small Mara almost missed it. A docking clamp authorization request routed through the Hollow Crown's own systems from one of the 6 escort vessels, flagged not as part of the negotiated transfer sequence, but as an independent maintenance inspection, the kind of routine paperwork that would have meant nothing at all if she hadn't spent the last several hours learning to read this ship's guts the way she'd once read a coolant gauge. Routine inspections didn't request access to the reactor deck. Routine inspections didn't route around the bridge's own authorization log on their way to asking for it. Isk, she didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. He was 3 consoles over, still moving stiff and careful, and crossed to her in 4 steps. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." He read it in silence for the length of one long breath. "You are not reading it wrong. That is a boarding request disguised as maintenance traffic, originating from the 9th Vigil, one of Adrahel's own escort. It is requesting a route directly to the reactor deck and the throne approach, avoiding every corridor currently staffed by loyalist crew." "Does Adrahel know?" "I do not know. I would guess from the routing that he is not meant to." Themis was already moving, dragging his splinted leg with a grim economy that made Mara's chest tighten, pulling up the *9th Vigil *S registry on the nearest live console with hands that had gone entirely steady despite everything else about him that wasn't. "Captain Rehel Astara," he read out, voice flat. "Council enforcement, but her service record shows 2 decades under fleet-marshal command postings, Vihorez's chain, before his transfer to flagship duty. If there is a faction inside the council fleet still loyal to what Vihorez represented rather than to Vihorez himself, this is exactly how it moves. Not with an open mutiny that can be logged and tried, but with a quiet reactor deck seizure timed for the hour everyone's attention is on the diplomacy happening on the bridge above it. Take the reactor, and it does not matter what Overseer Adrahel agrees to on camera. Whoever holds the reactor holds the ship, the same lesson Vihorez tried to teach us hours ago, from people who apparently did not learn it the first time it failed. Mara looked at the sensor plot, at a shuttle already detaching from the 9th Vigil *S flank on a heading that had nothing to do with any negotiated transfer route, and felt the same cold, clear click settle into place that she'd felt staring down a countdown with her hand on an alien throne. How long to the reactor deck? 12 minutes if their pilot is good, less. Then we don't meet them there. We make the deck itself useless to anyone who isn't supposed to be standing on it. She was already moving to the lattice, hands finding the pressure nodes with a fluency that would have been impossible hours ago and felt, now, disturbingly close to natural. ISK, the same diagnostic backdoor I used on the directive lockout. Does it reach the reactor deck's local access grid? It reaches everything the throne reaches. Which is, at this point, everything. Then we lock every door on that deck to anyone whose authorization doesn't already have my signature on it. And we do it quietly enough that Captain Astara doesn't realize she's walking into a sealed box until she's already inside it. Mara worked the lattice, watching the schematic bloom wide across the dais exactly as it had when she'd hunted the purge directive seam, except this time the ship answered on the first attempt. No failed sequences, no violent rejection, full, uncontested working command, precisely as Shadorl had promised it would be once it was truly earned. Doors along the reactor deck's access corridor cycled to a lockout status one by one across the display. Silent, invisible to anyone not already watching the schematic that showed them closing. She did not tell Overseer Adrahel what she was doing. That was, she understood even as she made the choice, a risk. If he learned an unauthorized human hand had just sealed 12 corridors aboard a ship still technically under council escort, the diplomacy she'd spent the last hour building might not survive it. But Themis's voice was in her ear reciting names, Yora Sten, Cade Asen, and she had made a promise to a dying captain about taking care of a crew. And that promise did not have an asterisk in it for except when it's diplomatically inconvenient asterisk. Captain Astara's boarding shuttle docked 9 minutes later into a reactor deck access tube that opened exactly once, admitted 6 armored figures in council enforcement gray with weapons drawn and reactor seizure kits already unpacked, and then sealed behind them into a 7-meter stretch of corridor with no route forward, no route back. And Mara made sure of this personally, watching the schematic with her hand steady on the lattice, full atmosphere, full gravity. And a live audio-visual feed, she immediately routed to the main bridge display, where Overseer Adrahel could watch it in real time. The transmission that followed was, by Themis's later account, one of the more satisfying 6 minutes of his entire service. Overseer Adrahel. Mara kept her voice level, the same steadiness she'd used on Vihorez with a countdown ticking behind her sternum, though this time the countdown was a different kind of pressure. The knowledge that she was one misjudged word away from turning a fragile peace back into a second war. I'd like you to look at the feed I'm about to send you, because I think you're going to want to ask Captain Astara a few questions before she becomes an official part of your custody negotiation. The overseer's frill, when the feed reached him, went through a sequence of colors that needed no translator at all. Shock, first, unmistakable and total, followed by something colder and more focused that Mara recognized, with grim satisfaction, as the exact look of an institution's doctrine failing in real time and an actual officer underneath it deciding what to do about the failure instead of denying it. Captain Astara. Adrahel's voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the careful diplomatic flatness from an hour earlier. Explain to me in the next 10 seconds why 6 of my enforcement personnel are logged requesting a asterisk maintenance route to a reactor deck currently under active custody transfer, on a heading that was never part of any order I issued. Whatever Astara said in her own defense, sealed in a dead-end corridor with a human's hand on the lock and her overseer watching every word of it, did not survive contact with the routing logs ISK had already pulled and forwarded, logs that traced her authorization, request back through a chain of approvals that led, 3 links up, to a staff officer on Adrahel's own flagship with a service history, under the same fleet-marshal chain Themis had already flagged. It was not. Mara understood, listening to Adrahel's voice go flat and hard in a register she hadn't heard from him yet, the whole of what Vihorez's doctrine had built inside the Ascendancy's fleet. It was one thread of it. But it was a thread that had just tried to pull, in full view of the officer whose authority it depended on believing didn't notice. And Overseer Adrahel was, whatever else he was, not a man who enjoyed discovering he'd been played for a fool in front of a human. He'd spent the last hour trying to outposture. "Release the corridor," he told Mara, 20 minutes later, once Ostara and her boarding party had been placed under a much less flattering kind of custody than the one they'd arrived expecting to hand out. "And human, I find myself owing you an apology I did not expect to owe when this escort left dock this morning. I came here to reclaim a stolen flagship from whoever was foolish enough to be holding it. I appear, instead, to have found the one hand in this entire sector currently capable of telling the difference between my fleet's official position and the parts of it that have not yet caught up to it. Apology accepted, Overseer. But I'd rather have it in writing, filed alongside Sergeant Themys's account of tonight, where it can't get quietly lost the way Captain Ostara's superiors were clearly hoping this whole thing would." Mara let her hand rest on the lattice, feeling the throne's slow pulse settle back to something closer to steady now that the reactor deck's lockdown had lifted, corridor by corridor, on her own unhurried authority instead of anyone else's demand. "You said the council will require a full accounting. I'd say tonight just handed you a considerably bigger one than you were expecting to write." It has. Something in Adrahel's frill had gone, for the first time, entirely without artifice, not respect exactly, not yet, but the particular exhausted honesty of a career officer recalculating a doctrine in real time and not enjoying a single second of the process. "I will need that account to be thorough, human. Sergeant Themys's testimony, Wright Vantor's, yours, the ship's own logs. And I suspect, when the council reads all of it side by side, several careers considerably more senior than Captain Ostara's are going to find themselves considerably shorter than they expected this season." "Good." Mara looked past the display, at Themys watching from his console with his splinted leg propped, and his data slate already updating, at Isk standing steady at her shoulder with one arm still strapped tight, at a bridge full of loyalist crew who had spent the last several hours learning, in real time, exactly how much their trust in a stranger was worth. "That's the account I want written, not the one where tonight gets filed away as an inconvenient mutiny that got contained. The one where it's on the record that the doctrine failed twice in one night, and both times it was competence that caught what rank couldn't." The Hollow Crown limped toward the nearest shipyard under escort 3 hours later, running on a skeleton crew of loyalists, Wrights, and the handful of prisoners who'd chosen, in the ship's long quiet aftermath, to stay aboard rather than transfer to the Council's ships, not out of loyalty to an empire that had jailed most of them for the crime of surviving its tithes, but out of something closer to loyalty to the woman who'd kept the ship, and by extension all of them, from dying with it. The freed prisoners numbered 11 in the end, humans and 2 other alien species Mara hadn't had time to properly meet yet, all of them pulled from cells scattered across the lower decks once the fighting stopped, all of them carrying the particular flat disbelief of people who had spent their transit expecting a tribunal or a grave and gotten, instead, a ship that needed hands and asked for theirs. Mara found herself, in the space of one very long evening, translating instructions to people who spoke 3 different first languages badly served by a translator built for Corvith syntax, and discovered that competence, it turned out, was a language that didn't need much translating at all. A wrench held out to the right person, a schematic pointed at with 2 fingers, and the work simply began. Isk found her on the observation deck 2 decks below the bridge, wound stitched and dressed, moving slower than he had a day ago but moving. He stood beside her at the viewport for a while without speaking, watching the stars slide past at the ship's cautious cruising speed, 6 council vessels holding formation around them like an honor guard that hadn't fully decided yet whether it was one. "My caste has another saying," he said eventually. "A machine remembers every hand that has ever understood it and forgets every hand that only ever held it." His frill in the low light had gone a soft, settled color she recognized now without effort, something like peace. "The hollow crown will remember your hand for a very long time, Mara Voss." "That's supposed to be comforting." "It is supposed to be true." He looked at her, gold eyes steady. "Your empire, the humans, I mean, the ones on your frontier worlds, do you have a word for what you did tonight? Ours does not properly. Ascension is the closest word we have, and it is the wrong one. Ascension is inherited or won by combat or granted. What you did was neither." Mara thought about it, watching the stars, feeling, for the first time since the blast door had blown open on her cell an entire lifetime ago, the specific, uncomplicated tiredness of a job finished rather than merely survived. "On Aldergate," she said, "we just call it fixing what's broken. Most days that's the whole job description." She looked at the reflection of the ship's slow blue pulse in the dark viewport glass, at the 6 escort vessels holding careful formation around a flagship that had, for one very long night, belonged to whoever could hold it, and now belonged, in every way that would ever matter to the machine itself, to her. Turns out, sometimes the thing that's broken is bigger than a fuel line. She didn't go back to the throne that night, not right away. She let Themys's second-in-command run the bridge watch, let the loyalist crew handle the 1,000 small repairs a wounded ship needed before it could call itself whole again, and stood instead at the viewport with a Corvette engineer who had bet his life on a stranger's competence and won, watching a fleet that had come to reclaim what it assumed was still theirs escort home a ship that had already decided, in the only language that mattered to it, whose it actually was. Behind them, far up the spine of the hollow crown, the throne kept its slow, steady pulse in an empty bridge, patient, unhurried, and for the first time in longer than its own records could confirm, no longer waiting for anyone at all. There was, 3 days before the shipyard tribunal opened, a memorial on the observation deck, Corvette custom, Themys explained apologetically, not something he expected a human to understand or necessarily want to attend. A slow procession of the ship's surviving crew passed a simple projected list of names with no ceremony beyond the names themselves, and the silence that followed each one. Mara attended anyway. She stood in the line behind 2 Wrights and in front of a provisioner she didn't recognize, and when Yora Sten's name resolved on the display, and then Cade Ossen's, she found she had nothing prepared to say and said nothing, and understood, watching 200 Corvette do exactly the same thing in the same silence, that grief didn't actually need a translator any more than fear had. Themys found her afterward at the viewport, the same spot where she'd stand with Isk again a week later, and didn't say anything for a while either. "Ossen's mother is a dock loader on the 3rd moon of Corvette Prime," he said eventually. "I am going to write to her myself, rather than let the fleet standard notice do it. He deserves better than a form letter." "What are you going to tell her?" "That her son held a stairwell for 11 seconds against odds no training prepares anyone for, and that everyone who made it out the far side of that corridor is alive because of exactly those 11 seconds, and that I will make certain, for as long as I hold any rank at all, that his name is spoken before mine whenever anyone asks who saved this ship." Themys's frill had gone the deep, steady blue she'd learned meant grief, and something harder under it that she was beginning to understand was simply what a soldier's grief looked like when it had somewhere useful to go. "It will not be enough. Nothing I write will be enough. But it will be true, and on nights like the one we had, true is the only currency that still means anything by morning." The tribunal itself opened 9 days after the mutiny, in a chamber Mara had never expected to stand inside as anything other than a defendant. She testified for 3 hours, flanked by Themys on one side and Isk on the other, both of them present not because the tribunal required it, but because neither had been willing to let her walk in alone. Overseer Adrahel testified after her, then Themis, then a parade of loyalist crew whose names Mara made sure the record spelled correctly. And by the time the tribunal recessed for the day, the formal charge sheet against Fleet-Marshal Vihorez Kelra ran to 41 counts, and the formal inquiry into Aldergate's tithe enforcement had grown, in 9 days, from a single footnote into its own separate proceeding with its own separate docket number. She saw Vihorez once more before the tribunal's first recess, through the transparent wall of a council-holding cell considerably more secure than the one she'd spent 8 days behind. He looked smaller than he had on the bridge, stripped of command plate and the particular authority that came from an entire crew flinching at his voice, and his frill, when it registered her on the other side of the glass, went through something that might have been rage and might, underneath it, have been something closer to the beginning of doubt. "You came to see me gloat," he said. The translator caught it flat, stripped of whatever subsonic weight the words had carried in the original. "I came because I told a dying captain I'd take care of her crew, and you're part of what's left of it, whether either of us likes that math." Mara didn't sit, didn't lean against the glass, just stood with her hands loosely folded the way she'd learned Reed to his species, as the truest kind of steadiness there was. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because I want you to understand something before the tribunal starts deciding what to do with you. You didn't lose to a human. You lost to the exact thing your whole doctrine told you couldn't matter, competence with no rank attached to it. If you spend your tribunal explaining that away as an anomaly, you're going to lose the only chance you have of understanding what actually happened here. And Marshal, whatever else you are, I don't think you're a stupid man. I think you're a man who built his whole career on a mistake nobody had ever made him pay for until tonight." His frill didn't answer in any color she'd cataloged yet. He didn't answer in words either, not for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't the voice of the man who'd promised to break her wrist on his own throne. "My cousin's report called you a rounding error," he said. "I wonder sometimes what the Ascendancy's ledgers would look like if we had spent the last century actually reading the rounding errors instead of dismissing them. You'd probably have a fleet that didn't need a mutiny to notice its rights were holding it together." Mara turned to go, then stopped, because there was one more true thing that needed saying, and she'd learned a long time ago that the true things were worth the extra 10 seconds. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong that the Ascendancy has problems worth fighting about. I just think you picked the worst possible way to fight them, and you were arrogant enough to believe nobody's smaller than you could ever prove it." She didn't wait for his answer. There wasn't going to be one worth hearing, and the tribunal had reconvened without her once already that morning. She did not ask to keep the throne. That surprised the council more than almost anything else she did in that chamber, a species that had spent generations assuming any hand that touched real power would grip it forever, faced with a woman who explained, plainly, that the hollow crown needed a command structure that didn't depend on one person's competence surviving the next crisis, and that she intended to help build that structure and then step back from the chair, not because she didn't want it, but because a ship this important couldn't be allowed to answer to only one hand ever again, human or otherwise. The compromise the council eventually reached, after considerably more debate than Mara suspected any single human had ever caused in that chamber before, named her advisory steward to the throne, an entirely new title invented for an entirely unprecedented problem, with Themis confirmed as acting security commander and Isk elevated, over the loud objection of exactly the kind of officer his caste had spent generations learning to expect objections from. To Chief Wright of the flagship's entire engineering complement. Pell's provisioner unit gained, by the tribunal's 3rd week, a standing invitation to observe engineering drills whenever her duties allowed, an invitation Isk had pushed for personally, and that the girl accepted with a frill flush of pure undisguised delight that made even Themys's flat soldier's expression crack into something like a smile. Mara sent word to Aldergate the same week, a message routed through channels that had never before carried a human voice speaking with Ascendancy Council authority behind it, addressed to a mining collective that had spent a decade assuming her either dead or worse, telling them, in words she'd rewritten 4 times before sending, that the tithe inquiry meant real change was coming, slower than any of them would like and further from finished than the council's press releases would claim, but real. And that she intended to make sure it stayed real for as long as she had any hand on any lever that mattered. She didn't know yet when she'd see Aldergate's docking ring again in person. She knew, with the same steady certainty she'd carried into a burning ship 9 days earlier, that she would. Themis found her 3 days after that, in what had become, by informal and entirely unplanned consensus, her workshop, a repair bay 2 decks below the bridge where she'd taken to spending the hours the throne didn't need her, elbow-deep in a damaged relay with 3 Wrights, and a nervous young provisioner watching over her shoulder and asking more questions than any of them had breath to answer. The council's preliminary finding came through, Themis said, easing himself onto an equipment case with the particular caution of a man who had been told exactly how not to sit and intended to ignore most of it. Fleet-marshal Vihoras Kelra stands stripped of rank and commission, pending formal tribunal. Captain Ostara and 4 officers implicated in the reactor deck attempt likewise. It will not root out everyone who believed what Vihoras believed. That kind of doctrine does not die, because 6 officers were caught reaching for it in one bad night. But it is, Overseer Adrahel tells me, the largest single accounting the Ascendancy's officer corps has faced in longer than my own service record covers. He paused. There is also a formal inquiry opening into tithe enforcement along the frontier worlds. Aldergate is named specifically in the preliminary scope. Someone on the council apparently found it difficult to justify continuing to prosecute a woman for sabotage, the same season they were crediting her with saving the flagship of the fleet. Mara set down the relay coupling she'd been threading and looked up at him properly for the first time since he'd sat down. They're dropping the charges. They are reconsidering the entire framework that produced them, which is a slower and considerably more useful thing than simply dropping one case. Something moved through Themis's frill that she'd learned over 3 weeks to read as the closest his species came to satisfaction. You did not do that by asking for it, human. You did it by being inconvenient to ignore. I am told that is a considerably more effective strategy than petitioning ever was. She thought about her mother, about a decade of ice hauls and quota audits, and a system built to make people like her invisible right up until it needed someone to blame, about a girl's 3-word question in a crawlway, about Yora Sten and Cade Asen, whose names Themis's account had made sure no fleet historian would get to quietly misplace. I'm not done being inconvenient, she said. Not by a long way. No, Themis agreed with something that was almost, for a Corvith security sergeant 3 weeks off a shattered leg, amusement. I did not imagine you would be.